All right, hello everybody. I'm going to do a screencast here for Unit 3 notes, the first set of notes for Unit 3. Unit 3 is on for loops and sequences. So this first set of notes, we'll be looking at some basic for loops using a new function called the range function. So that's what we'll look at today. So your starter project in Replit has several files. We'll be in the one that is called forloops.py. I believe it will already be set up to import that for you. So you should be all set up on the forloops.py file. All right, so this will be an introduction to for loops. The first time we write the code together, you should have already watched the screencast going over conceptually what a for loop is. So you should have a grasp of it already. We're going to show you how to write the code here together today. So intro to for loops, and we'll also learn counting with the range function. All right, before we look at a for loop though, let's just remind ourselves of what a while loop would look like. All right, and throughout these notes, I'll have some challenges for you. So the first challenge would be, since we're going to do basically count loops today with for loops, let's remind ourselves what that looks like with a while loop. So go ahead and print hello world 10 times using a while loop. Go ahead and pause the video and do that on your own, and then come back and we'll solve it together. Okay, so if you have finished the challenge, if you recall back to while loops, the way we did count loops is using a counter variable. All right, so with these while loops, the counter variable is the looping variable. So we're going to have the counter checked each time around the loop. So for example, we're going to count and do something 10 times. We go 0 all the way up to 9, and not including 10. And then we would print hello world. And then we always need to update our looping variable. So we'll add 1 to our counter variable. And we should have a loop that can execute 10 times. So we can see it print hello world 10 times. Right. So it's important to note, and the reason that we started with this is that everything that we can do with for loops, we could also accomplish using while loops. They just serve different purposes. Right? They're both repetition structures. They can both loop and repeat parts of code. But a for loop is useful because a for loop will allow us to iterate a sequence. And then it will execute loop body for each element in sequence. Right, so we'll be able to look at sequences. Really, the only sequence we've looked at and know so far are strings, but we're not going to focus on strings in this screencast. Instead, we're going to focus on a different type of loop. But if we were going to write this for loop in pseudocode, here's what it would look like. So here's the syntax for a for loop. So you're going to have the for keyword followed by a loop variable. So this is a variable that you're going to get to name. And this variable is going to be used to access elements of a sequence. So it's going to look in. So we're going to use this in keyword, this in operator, to look in some sequence of values. The for statement is going to end with a colon, just like a lot of our other logic structures do. Right? And then we're going to repeat the statements for each item in whatever sequence we're looking at. Okay? So here's the general pseudocode format for a for loop. So we've got the for statement, be the first line of the for loop. Okay. Begins with the for keyword. And we have the, just like we did with while loops, we have the loop body is the indented chunk of code beneath the for statement. All right, so a similar structure to the while loop, except for now it's for rather than while. All right. All right, so we're going to print hello world 10 times using a for loop here. And look at our first example of a working for loop. In this case, as I mentioned, we know one type of value we know that is a sequence is a string. So we'll use that as our first example. So if we have a string, all right, we can use that as our sequence. So we could create a sequence 0 through 9, perhaps. So a string that's 10 characters long. So we've got our for statement that we just wrote, followed by our loop body. All right, so again, looking closer at the statement, got a for keyword, a looping variable we're calling num. We just made that up. In keyword, and then a sequence, which is a string in this case. So if we run this code, we can print hello world 10 times. All right, same as we did for a while loop. All right, so all right, yeah, so this is the loop body, and the loop body is also called the indented block. So this is a block that runs, again, for each item in sequence, right? So if there are 10 elements in our string, 10 characters in our string, then our loop body would run 10 times. All right, so in this case, we've got the numbers 0 through 9. So if we just printed num in this case, we would get 0 through 9 printed out. If we wanted to print out the numbers 1 through 10, we could do that. Let's go ahead and write that loop. So we'll loop through the same sequence, that same string we just looked at. And now in this case, we'll take each number, which is each character in our string. And we know we start at 0, and if we want to print 1 through 10, we can add 1 each time the loop executes to print out the numbers 1 through 10. Okay, so in these first two examples, we didn't use our looping variable, you noticed, right? Num accessed these elements in this case, but we didn't even use num. All we did was just print something 10 times. In this case down here, we're actually using num now. Now we're looking at each item, using that item, converting it to an integer, adding 1 to it so we can get our numbers 1 through 10. All right, so you have the option to use the looping variable inside the loop. You're by no means required to. So in this case, num is a loop variable, accesses each element one at a time. So just an important note here. Oftentimes you will use the loop variable in the body of the loop, but you don't have to. Suppose it's also important to note that we can print that looping variable even after the loop ends. So it exists outside the loop. So notice that the loop variable exists outside the loop. The value is 9 in this case. Okay, so let's look at that again. So we'll say, yeah, so we print 1 through 10. You can see in the output here, and then after the loop is over, we print that num again, and the num value is 9. Right? All right, now that would be pretty tedious if we had to assemble a string every time we wanted like a series of numbers. So luckily that's not the best way to create a range of numbers to loop through. Rather, we have this nice handy dandy range function, which we're going to learn about. And this is a built-in function, built-in Python function. All right, so what it does, it returns immutable. Talk about that word in a second. So it returns an immutable sequence of integers of the type range. I'll put that in caps because it's a new type for us. And so immutable sequence returns an immutable sequence of integers of type range. So this is commonly used to commonly used for looping a specific number of times with a for loop. So it's purposeful that we're introducing this now. It's commonly used with for loops. Use this new term immutable. So when you see that term, this will come up more than once in this class, but immutable means it cannot change once it's created. It's unchangeable, it's immutable. And this function accepts or can accept 3 arguments. All right, so I'm going to copy and paste this because there's several things going on. But when you call this range function, right, we call it using parentheses just like we would any other function. And then the first value that you might possibly put in, and you can see this is optional, is the starting value for a range. So that's the first argument you might pass. You can comma separate that from a second argument, all right, which is a required argument, which is the end of the range, which is going to be exclusive of whatever value you put in. So if you put in 10, it's going to go up to and including 9. And then the final value, which is, again is an optional value, is the step value, which is how many how much each one steps by to the next one. So if you put it 2 here, it'll be every other number in your range. Yes, that's how that works. So let's look at some examples, be a little more concrete in that case. All right, so if you want to look at an example of a range with only one argument passed, so in this case, you're passing the end argument only, and you assemble a range of 5, then the range object that gets created, in this case, will print out, so the printed range of 5, it prints out range 0, 5. So that's what prints out, which is a little weird and actually not very useful to us. So we're not going to print out our ranges very often. So we won't really do this all that often where we'll print out a range. Rather we'll use them directly to loop through. And these are, like I said, a new type of object for us. These are a range object. And if we use the type function to figure out what type of object they are, you can see that Python will tell us that the type of object is a range. Right, so the object comes from the class range. Now, if we want to visualize this a little better, and we do want to print out the range just so we can see it, there is this other function called list that will take our range of objects and kind of parse it out into a list for us so we can actually see it a little better. So in this case, I'll just say this is a listed range, and we'll be able to actually see this thing a little better. So here you can see this range object from 0 to 5 actually doesn't include 5. It's actually 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Right, so it's a range starting at 0. That's 5 elements long. So that's one way to call the range function. Second way to call the range function is to pass two arguments. So a start and an end. So in this case, we're using the optional start one and the required end value. So range of numbers 1 to 6 in this case. So the range that would provide us, actually, let's not do the printed one. Let's do the listed range from 1 to 6. So let's actually put this into a list before we print it. Yeah, so if you say 1 comma 6, you're going to get 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So again, up to but not including 6. Or we've seen this with a couple functions already, right? Rand range worked the same way, similar to the range. And let's look at one more example of a function call that has all three arguments passed to it. So again, looking back up at our little template here, so it has a start value, a stop or end value, and a step value. So using all of the arguments. I guess I used the 182 example. And again, let's list this out. That's a little more useful, actually. All right, so the printed range in this case, I guess I use the terminology listed range, but the listed range 182 is going to provide you with 1, 3, 5, and 7. Okay, so 1 up to 8, not including 8, and steps by 2. So every other number is included included in the range. All right. All right. Like I said, though, I mean those examples we used are not real practical. You don't do that all that often. Oftentimes, how it's used is just as a quick way to create a basically a count control loop, kind of like we did with while loops. So if you wanted to display the numbers 1 through 20, looks like the example we're going to use here, for num and range, you could say 1 to 20. That's a quick way to assemble those values for yourself into a range that you can then print or do whatever you want with. Oh, it only went up to 19. Oh, so 20 is going to be exclusive, right? So that was a mistake. So if I redo that over, if I want to go 1 to 20, remember I want to be 21 up to, but not including the second argument, right? So in that case, right, a little hard to see on the small output, but you get 1 all the way through 20. Okay, an example of controlling range with a bit more detail. Let's say we wanted to do 10 to 20 by 2s. Just as an example. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and store my range before I loop through it. So first I'll assemble the range for this example. And remember the third argument is the step value. And I'll loop for each number in my nums range, and I'll print my number. Then you get 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, and 20, which is exactly what I wanted. All right, so you can see how this is a quick little way to assemble these ranges of numbers to allow you to do lots of different types of things. So we're going to look at a couple practice challenges here. So 2 quick little challenges for you guys to try, and then there will be some application challenges that follow. You're going to try to apply this to some like word problems. Okay. So the first couple, first one, go ahead and try is you can pause the screencast and try this first practice challenge. Try to create a loop that will count by threes from 3 to 99, inclusive of 99. Okay, so here's an example of how you would solve this. So for some number in the range, starting at 3, up 2, and including 99, you'd have to go to 100. If you want to step by 3, you would use 3 for your step value, and you would print whatever your looping variable was called. We get starting at 3, all the way up to and including 99. Looks good. All right, the second quick practice challenge here, try to count down. All right, so try to count down by 2s from 10 to -10, including -10. Okay, pause the video and try that. All right, here's how you would do that. So again, for some number in a range, in this case, our starting value is 10. We want to go up to, but not including -10. And we're going backwards this time, remember. So this was a little tricky because you had to go backwards. And if you want to go one more than -10 in the negative direction, you would be at -11. And -2 is our step. So you can not only step in the positive direction, you can step in the negative direction. So -2 because we want to go backwards, and then print n. And then here's our output starting at 10, going all the way up to and including -10. Okay, I'm going to stop the screencast here, but we're going to move on next to the application challenges, and I'll have separate screencasts that go and step through these and show you solutions. All right, so go ahead and try these on your own.